Whether you're a player trying out a game for the first time, or a game designer trying to design a game from the ground up, you're going to be asking several similar questions. One of the first questions you're probably going to be asking is, how do I win this game? One of the questions that's going to follow soon after that, however, is going to be, how do I play my cards? How do I take this card I have here in my hand and move it onto the field? Which brings us to the next essential element of trading card game design, resource engines. A resource engine is a system that allows for unequal costs to cards and effects. While it's relatively easy to find examples of life and score systems within other card games, finding examples of resource engines in card games is quite a bit more difficult. It's much easier to look over to board games for examples of these kinds of systems. However, no matter the game, resource systems can be broadly divided into two main types: renewable and consumable. Renewable resources are resources that, once they are used, are only out of commission for one turn, and then they are again available for use. This leads to a very linear ramping up of resources. You get one resource on the first turn, then the second turn you play another resource bringing you up to 2, and then the third turn you've got 3, 4 on turn 4, and so on. The later the game is, the more resources you have available and the more powerful plays you're going to be able to make. A notable subset of renewable resource systems with a slightly different play pattern is fixed renewable resources, like clicks in Netrunner or your normal summon limit in YuGiOh. Your resources are renewed each turn, but unlike the first category, they don't increase. You get the same number of resources to spend each turn of the game. The second main flavor of resources is consumable resources. These accumulate over multiple turns, but they can only be used once. Once the resource is used, it's gone, it's no longer available. While renewable resources have a built-in natural momentum to the game as your total resources are constantly increasing, consumable resources have a more static natural play pattern. You build up resources, then you spend those resources to try and damage the opponent, and then you're back down to 0 and you have to start the process all over again. While this more static development is definitely a downside of consumable resources, the upside of these systems tends to be that they are much less straightforwardly linear and a lot more flexible. Each resource in a renewable system has a fairly high impact, since that resource can now be used for every turn for the rest of the game, which ultimately limits how many different ways a game can give these resources to the player. However, since adding additional consumable resources has a much lower impact overall, there's a lot more freedom in how to develop these systems. You can get creative in the source of the resources, like using damage as a resource in Vanguard, or defeated units as a resource in Recross. Or you can combine these systems with other resource systems, like in Netrunner that combines a consumable resource in credits with a fixed renewable resource system in clicks. One of the more popular tools to combine with a consumable system is a level system. Leveling up is not a resource in and of itself, but it creates momentum and power scaling as the game progresses, similar to what we can find in renewable systems, which can then be combined back in with the build-up payoff pattern of consumable resources, creating a dynamic back and forth momentum. So, why are resources so important to trading card games? In the previous video on life systems, I mentioned how important it was for a game to contain cards that are useful at different stages in gameplay, not only for the gameplay experience itself, but also to create enough different designs to support an expanding game. If a life system is what allows for the possibility of this division of cards into early, mid, late game cards and all the flavors in between, then resources are the practical tool that allows this division to be implemented. Resources allow for power scaling and can give games a sense of momentum, as your more powerful late game cards outclass the early game cards, while the early game cards hit the ground running and try and give you an early advantage. While this makes sense on an abstract level, one of the easiest ways to see how important resource engines is to take a look at a game that had a very rudimentary resource system when it was first released. And that game is YuGiOh. YuGiOh's initial resource system was a simple once per turn normal summon limit, which they attempted to combine with tribute summonings to allow for the possibility of different power levels. However, tribute summonings were never a particularly viable mechanic, even back in the storied days of Summoned Skull Beatdown. As the game continued to release more and more new sets, the game eventually had to MacGyver a way out of this by creating an entirely new resource mechanic, and that led to the creation of the extra deck summoning mechanics. These systems allowed for a far more dynamic use of resources, since the summoning conditions could be made for the early game using relatively easy combinations of components, or they could be biased towards the late game by having more complex summoning requirements on more powerful cards. Without the resource system, there was simply not enough design space to support an expanding game, which goes to show that resource systems are necessary for trading card game design.